The surveillance market used to be the domain of nation-states with unlimited budgets and dedicated physical operatives. Now it operates through the airwaves, targeting the device in your pocket without you ever knowing. We are looking at a landscape where spyware like Pegasus and localized interceptors like Stingrays dictate the terms of digital privacy. The targets are journalists, dissidents, activists, but the tactics they use to fight back are fundamentally shifting the economics of this surveillance.
The psychological toll of that invisible targeting is staggering. When someone realizes they are being tracked by a stingray or infected by Pegasus, the immediate reaction is usually paralysis. The device they rely on for connection becomes a live microphone for their adversary. But the people actually surviving this, the activists and reporters operating in hostile environments, they have moved past paralysis. They are actively disrupting the data capture. They realize they don't have to defeat a multi-billion-dollar intelligence agency in a cyber war. They just have to make the process of surveillance so noisy, unreliable, and expensive that the attackers are forced to look elsewhere or risk exposure.
That shifts the entire framework. It stops being about building an impenetrable fortress and starts being about attrition. Let's look at the localized threat first. Stingrays, IMSI catchers. They mimic legitimate infrastructure.
They operate by exploiting the fundamental trust baked into cellular protocols. Your phone is programmed to constantly seek out the strongest cell tower signal. A stingray simply broadcasts a signal that appears to be the strongest tower in the vicinity. Once your phone connects, the device forces a downgrade in the connection protocol, often pushing it down to 2G, which lacks modern encryption. From there, the operator can extract the International Mobile Subscriber Identity, or IMSI, number. They can log metadata, track physical location with terrifying precision, and in some cases, intercept the actual content of unencrypted calls and messages. But understanding that mechanics is exactly how targets are fighting back. If the attack relies on the phone's automatic behavior, the defense requires stripping away that autonomy. That is where physical isolation comes into play.
Faraday shielding, putting the device in a pouch that blocks all electromagnetic signals. That feels incredibly analog for a digital threat.
The analog nature of the defense is precisely why it works. You cannot hack a physical barrier blocking radio frequencies. When a target places their phone in a Faraday pouch, they are not just hiding. They are taking control of their digital presence on the grid. A stingray cannot log an IMSI number if the device is essentially dead to the network. It forces the surveillance operator to deal with dark zones. If an investigative journalist only takes their phone out of the Faraday shield in highly populated, random areas, the adversary's tracking map looks like a series of disconnected, chaotic dots rather than a coherent route. The device only exists when the target decides it exists.
That covers the localized radio interception. The other tactic is rotating the hardware itself, switching SIMs, changing IMEI numbers, using temporary burner phones to break the tracking patterns tied to a specific identity.
Hardware rotation breaks the continuity of the data stream. If an intelligence agency has tethered their Stingray operations to your specific IMSI number, dumping that SIM card instantly blinds them. They have to start the identification process all over again. They have to physically locate you, deploy the cell site simulator, capture all the identifiers in the area, and filter through them to figure out which new number belongs to you. It turns a passive monitoring operation into an active, labor-intensive manhunt.
I don't know, that feels too clean to me. If an adversary has the resources to deploy a stingray, they have the algorithmic capability to correlate a new SIM card to your existing physical movement patterns almost immediately.
They definitely have the capability, but correlation requires time and introduces a margin of error. Actually, the better way to frame it is that switching SIMs isn't supposed to be a permanent cloaking device. It is a delay tactic. Every time a target swaps a SIM, the surveillance team's automated tracking breaks. A human analyst has to step in, review the spatial data, confirm the new identity, and reprogram the tracking parameters. If a target is swapping SIMs rapidly, they are burying the analysts in administrative overhead. The goal isn't to vanish completely, The goal is to make the act of tracking so resource-intensive that the operation becomes unsustainable. You are forcing them to burn cycles on basic identification rather than gathering actionable intelligence.
That introduces the concept of air gapping, taking sensitive work off the networked device entirely. If the phone is compromised, the data isn't there to be taken.
Air gapping is the ultimate concession that the network cannot be trusted. If we move from Stingrays to something like Pegasus, which is a military-grade spyware that turns the device itself into a traitor, encryption in transit means absolutely nothing. End-to-end encrypted apps are useless if the attacker has root access to the operating system and is simply reading the screen over your shoulder. By keeping critical nodes, contact lists, and draft communications on a non-networked device, the target isolates the blast radius of a compromise. Even if Pegasus silently infects the daily carry phone, the adversary only captures mundane logistics. The highly sensitive material remains physically separate, requiring an entirely different vector of attack to access.
Pegasus bypasses all those network defenses through zero-click exploits. It doesn't require a phishing link. It doesn't require the target to make a mistake.
The sophistication of zero-click exploits is genuinely unsettling. They abuse vulnerabilities in how operating systems parse mundane files, like rendering a GIF or processing a message notification. In 2021, researchers found a vulnerability dubbed forced entry that allowed Pegasus to infect iPhones without any user interaction whatsoever. The spyware simply arrives, unpacks itself in the background, and assumes control of the camera, microphone, and local storage. The target receives no alert, the device looks and behaves normally. Against that level of intrusion, a Faraday bag or a burner SIM provides no defense once the device connects to a network. The infection is persistent and invisible.
Which brings us to creating unreliable intelligence. If you can't stop the infection, you poison the well, breaking patterns, varying routes, altering online habits.
Behavioral unpredictability ruins the predictive models that intelligence agencies rely on. Surveillance is fundamentally about establishing a baseline and looking for anomalies. If a target always takes the same route to a source meeting or always logs into a specific secure portal at a certain time, the adversary knows exactly where and when to deploy their most expensive assets. By intentionally injecting chaos into their daily routine, targets force attackers to spread their resources thin. A journalist might take 3 different modes of transport, leave their primary phone in a locker, and use a layered identity to access a completely separate set of accounts. There is no overlapping metadata for the algorithm to latch onto.
Misinformation seeding takes that a step further. It's not just hiding the real signal, it's manufacturing a fake one to misdirect the adversary.
It is counterintelligence on a personal scale. If a target suspects their device is compromised by Pegasus or that a Stingray is logging their location, they can start feeding false breadcrumbs into the system. They might draft a highly sensitive-looking email about a fake rendezvous at a specific location, leave it in their drafts folder, and wait. If they see physical surveillance elements show up at that fake location, they have confirmed the compromise without alerting the attackers that they know. It exposes the leak and burns the adversary's operational time. More importantly, it destroys the adversary's confidence in the intelligence they are gathering. If half the data they extract is deliberately fabricated, the entire surveillance operation becomes a liability rather than an asset.
Monitoring the monitors, using cell tower mapping apps to detect unusual base stations. The hunter becomes the hunted.
There is a whole ecosystem of tools designed to expose this infrastructure. Apps that map legitimate cell towers can flag when a new unregistered base station suddenly appears in the area. If a target is moving across a city and notices that a newly minted cell tower seems to be following them from neighborhood to neighborhood, that is a massive red flag. They are looking at a Stingray operation in real time. Beyond that, targets are performing baseline device audits. They monitor battery drain, CPU spikes, and network logs for anomalous pings to unknown servers. Pegasus works hard to hide its tracks, but running continuous surveillance requires power and bandwidth. By logging these micro-anomalies, targets build a forensic trail.
Wait, does that actually hold? Because logging anomalous pings requires a level of technical sophistication that most people, even investigative journalists simply do not possess while operating in a crisis zone.
It is an incredibly valid criticism. Expecting a human rights worker to suddenly become a forensic network analyst while under threat of arrest is absurd. But the dynamic is shifting. They're not doing this in isolation. They are partnering with organizations like Amnesty International's Security Lab and Citizen Lab. Those groups provide automated tools and remote auditing services. The target just has to run the diagnostic tool and send the encrypted logs to the experts. In Serbia, journalists who received suspicious messages containing hyperlinks worked directly with Amnesty Security Lab, which confirmed they were being targeted by a domain associated with NSO Group's Pegasus. The technical burden is being offloaded to specialized civil society organizations, allowing the targets to focus on the behavioral defenses.
That offloading strategy ties into the economic warfare aspect, forcing operational costs up. If you can't outcode them, you outspend them by wasting their money.
The economics of zero-day exploits are mind-boggling. A Russian outfit called Operation Zero recently offered up to $20 million for successful zero-day exploit chains for mobile devices. These vulnerabilities are incredibly expensive to acquire and develop. If an intelligence agency burns a multi-million-dollar exploit to infect a phone, they need that infection to persist. Targets counter this by performing frequent OS reinstalls and full device wipes. Even if they don't know they are infected, wiping the phone every 48 hours forces the attacker to redeploy the exploit. Every deployment carries a risk of detection. If the exploit is captured by security researchers during one of those redeployments, the vulnerability gets patched by Apple or Google, and that $20 million investment evaporates instantly.
Keeping devices ruthlessly patched, it shrinks the shelf life of the weapon.
Exactly the opposite of complacency. Software updates are often delayed by average users because they are inconvenient. For a targeted individual, a delayed patch is a death sentence for their data. The window between an exploit being discovered and a patch being applied is when attackers do their most aggressive data harvesting. By updating immediately, targets slam that window shut. Furthermore, targets are using multiple secure channels. They fragment their communications. They might use Signal for one source, Session for another, and Threema for a third. This forces the attacker to compromise multiple distinct environments to get a complete picture, multiplying the technical effort and the financial cost of the surveillance operation.
The cost of the hardware itself is also wildly disproportionate. While 0 days cost millions, the tactical hardware is getting alarmingly accessible.
The commodification of surveillance is terrifying. While Pegasus represents the apex predator of the digital realm, stingrays have trickled down to local law enforcement and even the private market. Someone recently offered a used police Harris Stingray on eBay for $100,000. The listing noted the device was untested, but the fact that military-grade MC catchers are surfacing on auction sites indicates how saturated the market has become. The barrier to entry is dropping. That forces targets to assume that localized interception is no longer the exclusive domain of national intelligence. A private corporate espionage firm or a well-funded local adversary could easily deploy a cell site simulator.
Which forces the defense into the legal and public spheres, bringing in outside eyes to create consequences for the operators.
We are seeing a massive shift toward legal accountability. In January 2026, a UK court ordered Saudi Arabia to pay £3 million in damages to a London-based dissident whose phone was infected with Pegasus. That is a watershed moment. It establishes financial liability for transnational repression. In Poland, criminal charges were filed in February 2026 against 2 former intelligence chiefs for using Pegasus without required security accreditation, jeopardizing sensitive state information. The shield of national security is cracking. By filing Freedom of Information Act requests, pursuing civil litigation, and publicizing forensic reports, targets are creating immense political and legal friction. The operators of these tools have to calculate whether spying on a specific journalist is worth a multi-million-dollar lawsuit or criminal indictment.
But that legal strategy has limits. Look at the Spanish investigation into the hacking of their own prime minister.
The Spanish case is a perfect example of state-level obstruction. The investigating judge had to shelve the Pegasus probe because Israel completely ignored 5 separate requests for judicial cooperation. They refused to compel NSO Group to hand over information or allow the CEO to be questioned. It highlights the asymmetry of the fight. You can file all the lawsuits you want, but if the state protecting the spyware vendor refuses to participate in the international legal framework, the investigation stalls. This is why targets cannot rely solely on the courts. The legal strategy is a component of a broader defense, but it has to be paired with ruthless operational security and technical disruption on the ground.